welcome everyone. Thank you for your time today. Um, what we're going to really look at today is just go into what the pay equity landscape is, look at what the business case is for change. Talk about a little bit about what different solutions are there, and go into some success stories, and uh, we'll see if we have any questions at that point. But there is a clear imperative for change, and we have seen that over the past few years, and since pay equity really became at the forefront, it is an ethical imperative, and it always will be an ethical imperative. It's the right thing to do for organizations to really achieve pay equity, be equitable within the organization. But then in the last kind of few years, we've also seen some really large organizations come under scrutiny for pay equity, and therefore, it is an ethical imperative, but it's also become a legal imperative for um, organizations where certain firms are definitely coming under scrutiny for discrimination issues, or pay equity issues, or a combination of them. And large organizations, including cities, are getting like a city here, Birmingham, came in the news and got bankrupt as a function of that, and is selling its assets. So um, it is an ethical imperative, it is a legal imperative. But over the last, I guess during COVID, it started to become more of a business imperative, where research came to the forefront, where organizations that were that had equitable compensation practices, fair recruiting practices, and promotion practices were seeing an increase in employee retention as well as attraction to um, the organization, and it became a business imperative at that point. So it's very important to kind of keep that in mind, that it was an ethical imperative, legal imperative, but over the course of kind of COVID, it became a business imperative too. And it still remains a big business imperative. There's research out there, like the one that you're seeing on the screen, that employees with pay transparency going into effect, candidates are not necessarily applying at times for roles where there's no pay range that's listed out there. So um, as a function of being transparent, as a function of being equitable, you're going to attract more candidates, you're going to retain more employees within the organization, and that's what the research has really shown. But then right after COVID, it kind of became more of a compliance imperative, really in line with like the EU pay transparency getting passed. And obviously we know that in the US there was pay transparency regulations that are getting passed all across the different states. Canada has a pay transparency requirement. So there, it went from being an ethical imperative, a legal imperative, a business imperative, to now it's just become a compliance imperative too, where not only are organizations now looking at auditing the existing compensation policy, for example, for equity globally, but also they're having to, in certain places, do it by local regulations. So whether it's EU Pay Transparency Directive, or if you're submitting pay data in the US, let's say for the recently um, approved regulation, which is Massachusetts or California or Illinois, organizations are now kind of looking to do it from a compliance and regulatory landscape too. So it's changing, but it doesn't mean that one or the other kind of goes away. It's all these imperatives, whether it's business, legal, ethical, and compliance imperative, are now really forcing organizations to look at their pay practices, but look at it more frequently. Maybe look at it, if you were looking at it once every 2 years or once every year, organizations now want to look at it more frequently on a rolling basis. So that's really what the change has happened within the pay equity landscape. Going into the pay equity standards and pay data reporting, so there are really three main pay equity frameworks that exist within the pay equity world, and one of them being equal pay for equal work. There's equal pay for comparable work, and then there's the equal pay for work of equal value. And equal pay for equal work is really what the U.S. federal standard is. For example, people performing equal work are getting should be paid equitably or equally. Then you have the employee equal pay for comparable work, which is employees performing substantially similar work must be paid equitably. And then substantially similar really just kind of means more with respect to skill, effort, responsibility, and working conditions. And then you have the equal pay for work of equal value, which is like an EU based concept, and there's other countries out there that have adopted the same thing. But what that really talks about is employees who are performing maybe completely different work, but can be shown that that work that they're performing on an objective criteria brings equal value to the organization, and those employees should be paid equitably. So that's the three different frameworks in globally when you look at pay data reporting. And those three frameworks really kind of fit in with the pay equity framework too, on how you analyze for pay equity. So when we talk about these laws, right, there's always been laws, and I go back to the analogy of like a freeway or a highway with no cops, and the law always existed that, hey, you shouldn't be driving over a certain speed limit, but maybe there was no enforcement activity. But now there's cops all over, and there's enforcement activity that's happening. Similarly, the laws have really existed all throughout, and but the reality is that there was no enforcement, or there was little enforcement. But with these new regulatory obligations that are coming in place, like the EU pay transparency or pay transparency in the US, reporting requirements to different government organizations, it's becoming clear that now there is enforcement that's happening, and this is also leading to organizations now looking at their pay on a more frequent basis. When we look at pay data compliance, a good way to kind of think about the global pay data reporting component is really fitting them into one of these four categories. Certain jurisdictions require you to collect the data and maybe sit on it and then produce the data when asked for. Certain jurisdictions want you to collect and analyze the data, as well as report the data. Some jurisdictions want you to collect, analyze, report, and be transparent when it comes to salary ranges. So basically all global regulations around pay data can be fit into one of these categories or all of these categories. And this framework of CART is a good way to just kind of think about it, even when you are thinking about which countries you operate in and where do you have employees and what regulations do you have to comply with. Just even categorizing the regulations into one of these buckets is going to be super helpful, right? So if you have, let's say, certain jurisdictions where you only need to collect the data and sit on it, if you just identify what those jurisdictions are, then you can proceed to the next step of, this is what I need to do for this jurisdiction, this is what I need to do for this jurisdiction. So it's a good framework to really kind of think about and start to segment the jurisdictions that you operate in, and start to put these different requirements in these different segments. And then, oftentimes we get asked this question where it's like, look, we operate globally in 50 countries, 60 countries, or if you're just operating, let's say, in the US, you have multiple states that you're operating in. But should we just look at it from a compliance standpoint and not just really look at it holistically? Yes, you could do that, and you'll be in compliance with what the regulatory requirement is, but you may inadvertently create more issues. So if you exclude certain employees, in this example, if you're just looking at it from an Illinois perspective, and you're only including the employees that are based in Illinois or report to a location in Illinois, and are not including employees, let's say, in Florida or California or even internationally, in UK and France, you could create more pay equity issues because you are just going to take into account the limited population that you've put into the analyses and maybe give a pay increase to a certain employee, but then you're not taking into account employees that are in different regions performing comparable work, similar work. You're not taking those into account. So you could have a potential issue right there. So it's very important that when you're looking at pay equity, you look at it holistically. And then, of course, kind of if you want to look at it by jurisdiction, see which jurisdictions have an issue, you can always do that too. So when we talk about this component right here with these different regulatory requirements coming into play, where you may have to analyze through different lenses, obviously the incumbent approach was looking at maybe doing this internally, working with a third party, looking at spreadsheets, PDFs, Word documents. But oftentimes those analyses would become outdated very fast. You could not look at it through different lenses if you had to. You could not run simulations. So what a lot of organizations are now kind of heading towards is modernizing their pay equity efforts and really modernizing it with the software solutions that exist. So there's a lot of different software solutions that exist in the marketplace, and really being able to leverage those software solutions to maybe run it in different ways, maybe have it connected with your HRIS system, in this instance UKG, so that it can pull the data as and when needed, run the analyses through maybe a global perspective, and then maybe run another analysis through a local jurisdiction perspective. However you want to do it, pay equity software is just allow you that flexibility and scalability that is needed in today's times with all these different regulations getting passed. So, quick question for attendees here today. We've asked this question multiple times in different events, and results pretty much stay the same. But just we'd love for you to answer this question: where how are you doing pay equity today? Are you using a third-party consultant, a software, law firm, in-house? You're still exploring options. Like I said, usually the results stay pretty consistent, but it'll be interesting to see with attendees today. So I'll give it 30 seconds here, and then we can see what the results are. Perfect. All right, so let's kind of look at the results, and out of the attendees today, no one's using a third-party consultant or a software or a law firm. 33% are doing it in-house, and 66% are exploring options. So I will say that this is usually what we see. We're starting to see a little bit of change now, where organizations are exploring, are starting to kind of move more and more towards third-party help, and more specifically looking at software solutions with consulting, so that you get best of both worlds at that point. But this is typically what we see, from a survey perspective. So good to know. Now moving on to, I know this is really a UKG specific webinar that we have, but the idea here being that when you modernize your pay equity efforts, make sure that the solution that you're using in certain ways connected with your HRIS system. That's very imperative. But then also look at options where whether or not there's the capability of the solution being being connected with your payroll systems, because oftentimes where global pay data reporting comes into play, where you're supposed to report your pay data to multiple jurisdictions, payroll platforms is where that data is sitting. So it becomes imperative that connection not only to your HRIS is there, but also to your payroll systems, and that becomes really starting to modernize your approach and streamline it and making it easy especially when you have to comply with multiple regulations. So that's one thing that I would definitely kind of point out. And then, as you modernize your approach, just make sure that you're analyzing it maybe more frequently, you're updating the analyses, you're putting in processes in place where you're not creating additional pay equity issues at the time of hiring or promotions. You're looking at it at the intersection of different protected factors. That becomes very important, especially in the US, looking at the intersection of gender and race. But those are some of the things that you should keep in mind as you're making efforts to modernize your pay equity audits. Now, obviously we have a pay equity solution, so I won't spend a lot of time on that, but I will say that our pay equity software solution um, is going to check all of those boxes, right? It's going to be connected with certain HRIS systems. That's a certified integration. It's robust methodology, comprehensive methodology, and then of course you can take care of your reporting requirements utilizing the software and the services that are provided that go along with it. More than happy to discuss this if you're interested. More than happy to set up a meeting and walk you through what that system and solution really looks like. So I'll in the interest of time, I'll skip through this and we'll set up one-on-one meetings, reach out to you to set up one-on-one meetings to kind of go through the system here. But just wanted to really share some findings that we've seen, working with different organizations. One that comes into mind is really, looking at employees companies that are trying to modernize their pay equity efforts, right? And one that comes to mind is really, this salary range finder, which becomes very important because this is where you're not really creating additional pay equity issues at the point of hiring, promotions, or transitions within the organization. And that is where a lot of organizations are heading towards is creating those pay equity ranges such that any decision that you take within that range is not resulting in any kind of additional pay equity issues, right? So that's an important thing to keep in mind. So I wanted to just point that out. Whatever effort you take in, whether you do this internally, whether you do this with a third party, good kind of end result to that analysis should always be that you create these pay equity ranges for each roles, right? And start to incorporate that as part of your hiring efforts and promotion efforts, as part of your internal pay ranges that you've created maybe as a function of survey data or other kinds of data. But make this part of your kind of day-to-day operations and share this with your recruiters or your hiring managers in a limited fashion, but so that they have visibility to okay, this is the range that we're going to be hiring within. So that's something that I wanted to just kind of quickly point out. I just wanted to open up for any questions, any items of clarification that may have come across. Pauline, is there any questions that we've received from the attendees?
You know what, Anuj? I think you did such a great job. We don't have any questions today, but that being said, if anyone does have additional questions or wants to meet one-on-one with one of our experts, I've dropped a link in the attendee chat where you can schedule a meeting. You can also use the schedule a meeting widget to do so. But given that there are no questions, I guess, we can give everyone back a bit of their time. So I do want to take a moment to thank everyone for attending our webinar, and a special thanks to you, Anuj, for lending your time and expertise. And then just a reminder that about 2 hours after the webinar, you should receive an email from us that will give you a link to access this console, where you will be able to download the slides, access any of the resources that we've posted, and if you decide at a later date you want to schedule a meeting, that will all be available to you in the console. So with that, I think we can conclude today's webinar. And on behalf of Trusaic, I just want to thank you guys all again for your participation and hope you have a wonderful day.